Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Papier, and I'm the Director of Programming for the Newmark Civic Life series of 92NY Recanati Kaplan Talks. We at the 92nd Street Y, New York, are so proud to co-present with Aspen Digital on tonight's event, Preserving Democracy, Information Disorder, and the 2022 Midterm Elections, a conversation with Krebs and Cecilia Kang. This program is also brought to you by the 92NY Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact through a generous gift from Craig Newmark Philanthropies. Before we begin, you'll hear a bit more about our speakers from Jeff Green, Senior Director of Cybersecurity Programs at Aspen Digital. If you are inspired to learn more about cyber policy after this conversation, we encourage you to sign up for the Aspen Cyber Summit on November 16th. The summit will be hosted in person at 92NY in New York City and available online as well. We'll provide a link in the chat to register along with a special promo code and then again at the end of the event. Also at the end of tonight's event, we ask that you take our 2-minute survey so that we can learn more from you. Please click on the QR code to be taken to the survey. We appreciate your feedback. Now here's Jeff Green for more about tonight's program. Thank you all for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. It's great to be here, and we're proud to be working again with the 92nd Street Y in New York. As Amanda mentioned, this special event is part of the lead up to the Aspen Cyber Summit on November 16. The full-day summit is one of the year's best stages for cyber policy discussion, and we're going to convene top leaders from business, government, academia, and civil society. We're thrilled with the lineup we have in place, and that starts with this timely discussion and these two great speakers. First, Aspen Digital Senior Newmark Fellow in Cybersecurity Policy, Krebs, and second, award-winning technology journalist and best-selling author, Cecilia Kang. Cecilia joined the New York Times in 2015 to cover technology and regulation and is the co-author of An Ugly Truth Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination. Before that, Cecilia was the senior technology correspondent for the Washington Post and was a staff writer at the San Jose Mercury News and with Dow Jones. Chris is a founding partner of the Krebs Stamos Group and previously served as the first director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS. Before becoming CISA director, Chris served in a variety of roles at the Department of Homeland Security, and before that directed U.S. cybersecurity policy at Microsoft. Chris also served in the George W. Bush administration, where he advised DHS leadership on domestic and international risk management and public-private partnerships. Tonight, we're going to discuss the most significant risks we face in the upcoming election and what we can do to counter them and to protect our democracy. With that, I'll hand off to Cecilia. Thanks again for joining us online, and enjoy the program.
Thank you, Jeff, for that kind introduction, and to the 92nd Street Y, New York, and Aspen Digital. I'm thrilled to be part of this important conversation on the role of disinformation and how it's playing in our upcoming and future elections. And in this discussion, we hope to take a broad view of what brought us to this moment in 2022, where there are a vast array of threats to the security and integrity of the elections, mainly brought by disinformation. And I thought that was a good place to start, Chris. You followed a few election cycles at this point, and as I've heard you say, 2020 built on 2018, which built on 2016. And I've also heard you refer to online threats of misinformation and disinformation as the Sputnik moment. Please set the scene for 2022. What do you mean by this being a new Sputnik moment? And talk about sort of the timeline that brought us to where we are today.
So Cecilia, thanks for that intro. And Amanda and Jeff, thanks for this setup and for hosting this event this evening. So it seems like 2016 was forever ago. And back in those days, the good old days almost, I was at Microsoft and we were tracking a number of threat actors that were using different techniques to try to break into email accounts and compromise credentials of notable officials that were either related to campaigns or to parties, political parties. And so at that moment, as I was kind of looking through the summer of 2016, through the fall of 16, through the election, and then you have all these alerts and reports and announcements coming out of the federal government, it becomes clear that the Russians were attempting to interfere in the 2016 election. And ultimately, in January of 2017, right at the end of the Obama administration, the intelligence community released what's known as the Intelligence Community Assessment. They released an unclassified report that in great detail, in an unclassified manner, details how the Russians attempted to interfere in that 2016 election. And there were three main vectors or approaches or attack vectors in that election, in those efforts to interfere. The first one was attempting to, scope out and get into election equipment, the systems that actually support the administration of elections at the state and local level. The second was a hack and leak campaign focused on the Democratic National Committee and on the Hillary Clinton campaign and some of her staffers, John Podesta namely. And then third and finally was this more kind of vague, ethereal, almost disinformation campaign that was trying to sow chaos, undermine confidence in our elected officials and our leaders, and just in the general political discourse in across the United States. And ultimately, as a friend, Sue Gordon, who was the deputy director for national intelligence during the Trump administration, said she's really, they're really trying to attack our hearts and minds and have us lose faith in ourselves in the American experiment. And that's really what that third fork or prong of the attack was about. And when you mentioned that I how I've called it a Sputnik moment before, and my the parallels clumsily I'm trying to develop here are that in 1957 when the Soviets put Sputnik into low Earth orbit, there were a number of people in the U.S. that took that as a significant wake-up call. Not as much because they beat us to space. That was absolutely kind of a bravado moment where they got there before us, kind of hurt our pride a little bit. But I think the more upsetting and concerning aspect of Sputnik was the fact of, how they got Sputnik into space. And it was the fact that it was launched on top of what's effectively an intercontinental ballistic missile. And so for the decades of the Cold War up to the date that we'd had this geographic distance where we could spot the bombers coming over the polar ice caps or across the Pacific or Atlantic. And we would have some degree of, time to prepare, time to launch our own counteroffensives. And then ICBM, you're talking very small amount of time. So again, it was about, as you draw the equivalence to 2016, we now saw that digital risks, cyber and information operations, propaganda and the like, we're able to undermine and attack our public institutions, undermine our confidence in our election, process, and ultimately attack democracy. And so those are the parallels I'm trying to draw here. And the most frightening aspect of all of this to me is that whether it's Russia or Iran, or even we're seeing now China and even domestic actors, these are intelligent actors that are improving, that are shifting, that are evolving their techniques. They're actually learning from one another. And so what was in 2016 a single foreign actor, now we have this whole breadth of risks and threat actors in the midst of our elections. And yes, I said foreign and domestic. And so
yes,
that brings us through 2018. Again, it was Russia. 2020, we had a mix of Russia. We had a mix of, you add a little dash of Iran, a sprinkle of China, and 2020 was a pretty active space. But it's what happened after 2020, the 2020 election and the months that followed, and even today, almost 2 years after 2020, the 2020 election, where we really see that it is a very dynamic space, that some of the tools that we have to counteract threats against elections and really enhance the resilience of elections have shifted, and we actually don't necessarily have all the tools that one might hope for, because, as I said, the actors are not all foreign. Our intelligence services and other tools of national security, the national security apparatus, I think are well equipped to address some of the threats from foreign actors. But when it comes to domestic threats to elections, I think we're still scrambling a little bit, and we are hindered in part by some of our own, constitutional protections, of course.
And Chris, along those lines, it does seem like a lot of the 2022 disinformation that I've been seeing is really new versions of or repeat of some of these narratives of 2020.
Yeah.
And also to your point about domestic actors, we're seeing candidates themselves as some of the spreaders of this information. Maybe you can talk about with some more, like maybe drill down a little bit more into domestic threats,
Sure.
as well as just generally what you'd see as the biggest threats right now in the midterms.
Yeah. So as I've been talking about threats to the 2022 election and, looking forward a little bit more into 2024, I see four primary threats or risks to the election. First is this continued delegitimization of the 2020 election results and whether the president was, President Biden was duly elected in a free and fair election. That has continued to calcify and almost metastasize throughout the political class, political elites, and that is then further reaching down into just the general population and the voting base in part, mainly in the Republican Party. There have been any number of focus groups that I've seen, that you've all seen over the last several weeks, where they bring voters in and they ask about the 2020 election. And there are so many people that are absolutely convinced that the election in 2020 was stolen, and yet cannot provide a single concrete, established, credible example of that stolen or rigged election, which is clearly a problem, but also an example of how this has really seeped into almost the zeitgeist of a political party. Now that then kind of or drifts and bleeds into the second threat that I'm concerned about, and that is this delegitimized concept is then manifesting in threats to election workers. We've seen the state of Georgia develop tools that election officials can then report to law enforcement when they get threats. The fact that you actually need a tool of that nature, where election officials would feel threatened by voters or the general public, is obviously a significant problem in and of itself. But the flip side of this is we're seeing intimidation and threats against voters themselves. And so out in Arizona, there are a number of pending felony investigations against those that have been watching the ballot drop box. There's an entire operation. There's a movement, in fact, a grassroots movement to get people out there to watch for ballot mules or traffickers or whatever the in vogue name is, which just like in and of itself is bizarre, right? So if a group discovered that there were ballot mules and ballot traffickers, and then there was a tell-all book and a tell-all movie that exposed that con about the 2020 level, that these people actually believe that, again, if this happened, that they're going to run the same playbook in the exact same state and expecting not get caught. So it just, there's maybe I'm just a little too logical about this, and others aren't. But the kind of the cherry on top of all of this is that, just like in Georgia, where there's a reporting mechanism for election officials, in Arizona, there's a reporting mechanism for voters that have been intimidated. So you're actually getting the voters that have been intimidated calling in and reporting, saying, hey, these guys accused me of being a ballot mule. By the way, here's my name and here's my number. Happy to provide additional information. So it just kind of exposes the lunacy and farce, the farcical nature of these continued claims of ballot harvesting and ballot trafficking, which again, this does not happen in any significant or meaningful scale, as has been established time and time again, not just by me, by actual law enforcement officers of the United States government, including the Attorney General, Bill Barr. The third threat that I'm concerned about is the actual infiltration of the election administration process by hyper-partisan, radicalized, and activated people. And we've seen examples of election officials or election workers, in one case in the state of Michigan, that inserted an unauthorized USB drive into an election system. Now, it was detected. There was no harm to the process. But nonetheless, it was just an example of how people have been led down this path. They've been led to believe that there's some sort of election or maladministration going on behalf of a political party, and they're putting their people on the insider. So this insider threat, and there are controls in place that you can that can be used to detect and prevent against these sort of things. But nonetheless, it's something that a couple of years ago we didn't actually have to worry too much about, because there wasn't this upswell or groundswell rather of this movement to get into the inside. So the fourth main concern I have is that as we're all domestically kind of at each other's throats, and the political discourse continues to degrade, and there's this threat of political violence, we actually do see some at least political intimidation that could lead up to political violence. It really makes it quite easy for those that foreign adversaries, for example, that may wish us harm or an ill fate. And so it gives there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of attack surface for the Russian government, for the Chinese government, for the Iranian government. They all have some sort of grievance to pick with the United States at this moment. And there are opportunities, I think, for them to just further exacerbate and magnify and amplify the degradation of discourse and create further chaos. And that's really, I think, ultimately what all these actors are trying to achieve right now is just chaos, and get us all to lose confidence in this process, so that then we don't know where to look. And so when someone stands up and seems to know what the heck they're talking about, we listen to them, we follow them. Mm-hmm. And that's ultimately the autocrat's playbook. It's the authoritarian's playbook. And as we've seen democracy in retreat globally, as deglobalization, multipolarity creeps in, and this rise of digital authoritarianism, this is where we actually need to be on our utmost guard and ultimately answer the question that we should all be asking ourselves: do we believe in this experiment of American democracy? And if so, then we actually have to be able to participate in it. We have to fight for it, and we have to get out there. And we can't let these threats sink in and in some way keep us from voting or expressing our political choice.
Chris, I definitely plan to come back to the foreign question and what's going on right now. And extraordinarily, the FBI actually issued a report earlier this month about Russia and China taking advantage of the moment to spread misinformation. But if I could go back to domestic actors, what you're saying about voters not knowing even where to turn. There's so much doubt out there. And what I found really extraordinary is that many candidates and sitting politicians who are not even actually up for a re-election, just simply raising the questions. It seems like things are messed up. We're recording today on October 27th. And today, Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, for example, tweeted in response to a story about Michigan election officials saying it's going to take many days to count votes. And he tweeted, blue states always say that it takes many days to count votes, have official vote tallies. Why is that the case? It should be able to, the count should happen within days. So we all know that that's not true. And depending on the state, there's a time when you can start counting votes, which in that particular state is the day of, is November 8th. In Arizona, there's a long period of mail-in vote counting, for example. So he's raising that question. Carrie Lake, who is running in Arizona, often goes right close to the line, but does not have proof, but will say it really needs to be investigated. There's just so much doubt about the integrity of 2020. How do these doubts play in? What is the threat of even just raising the specter? It seems like what I observe is that a lot of voters are kind of primed over 2 years with these doubts and these theories that they've heard from 2020. And now they're actually acting. They're bringing arms to these ballot boxes, et cetera.
How much time do you have, Cecilia? I was at an event a couple of weeks ago, and I'm a CBS News contributor. I do a fair amount of media, and I was remarking to a senior executive at one of the media outlets, and I said, "Look, I can get on TV and I can talk about cybersecurity issues technology risk issues in a very measured, clinical way. But as soon as you start asking me questions about disinformation, targeting democracy and domestic politics, I get very animated. I get very excited. I get flushed. I get red. It's just, look, back to 2020. I was fortunate to be in the right place in the right time. And I like to think that the team that I worked with, that we did a good job, and that we ultimately defended democracy. We upheld the Constitution. We put country over party. But now, to your point, it's like the dynamics are shifting throughout the political ecosystem. And I think three things are happening. First is that the incentive structures have shifted pretty dramatically. So prior to 2020, or at least 2018 or before, there wasn't a whole lot of benefit to a political, an elected official or a candidate to go on deranged rants or toe the line, as you've said, on the abuses of the election process. It was in the fringes. It was absolutely in the fringes. It was not a mainstream thing. But the incentive structures now, for two reasons. One is it actually benefits you. It gets you cachet in the community, particularly in the MAGA base, because it aligns with what the former president said. And that as long as the former president continues to push this narrative, it is kind of the expectation. It's kind of the standard that you have to meet. There's a second aspect of those that maybe aren't going to go, full blown election denier here, and yet they won't denounce it. They won't speak out against it. They won't fully endorse it, but they kind of play that squishy middle. And in part, they're not so much seeking the approval. They just don't want to invoke the backlash. They don't want to be labeled a rhino. They don't want, so there's a massive piece of this that is not, it's just about sitting in the middle and trying to keep your head down and survive till the next political battle. So that's kind of the incentive structures. Again, it's a lot of this is about seeking power. It's about retaining influence. And then, of course, fundraising and money. And yes. Election denialism is a huge way to raise a significant amount of money, as we've seen the former presidents raise probably hundreds of millions of dollars on even what was it, 250 million in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 election. So those incentive structures then lead to a permission structure change, where you actually start pushing crazier and crazier things because it is in fact acceptable, because it's come into the mainstream. Because to your point, we're just asking questions. That's like the baseline now. Just asking questions is the baseline. Introducing doubt, undermining confidence in a process that responsible elected officials out there. Stephen Richer, Maricopa County recorder in Arizona, yes. He's been radically transparent in what the county is doing. He spends the majority of his day right now responding to questions, not just from the general voting population, which of course he does, but also from other officials in the Arizona Senate, for instance. And they keep bringing up the same thing that he debunks over and over. So again, permission structures have shifted, which then all continues because there's no accountability measure. The only accountability measure we really have right now in American political discourse of any kind of immediacy is at the ballot box. But then you take it back to the incentive structure thing, where that's what this is almost what the voters want to hear. They want to hear that Trump was robbed, because that's what they believe. That's what they've been told. And I'm not going to get into this whole like George Orwell 1984 thing, but it really has come full circle, where they were told what to believe. They believe it, and now they expect their political leadership. So there's been an entire systematic failure of political leadership throughout the Republican Party. That's my belief. That had an opportunity early on to cut this thing out, but it just was too beneficial, too much of a fundraiser, and also maintaining cred. And along the way, we've just continued to push the bar up. And what that's gotten us where we are today, where you have candidates for office, statewide office, like the GOP candidate for governor in Arizona, GOP candidate for governor in the state of Pennsylvania. You have secretaries of state in Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, and elsewhere that are running on this platform of the 2020 as a stolen election. And some have even gone as far to say that if they were elected in, and one of the first things they would do in office would be
decertify 2020,
the 2020 election, which just, so everybody knows that's not a thing, that doesn't exist, certainly not in the Constitution or federal law, state law. I'm not aware of that either. So this is all performative. And that's just kind of the reality. In addition to causing chaos, there is a whole bunch of performative political actions right now. And look, I am cabining this very tightly right now around the 2022 or the 22 election and the threats as I see it. There's all sorts of political hijinks happening across the board. But when we're talking about the 22 election, I think that the Republican Party has a significant amount of responsibility for this just general undermining of confidence and this lack of confidence we have looking, a couple weeks out.
Well, thanks, Chris, for fact checking the conspiracy theory that you can decertify as a state official the 2020 election. Also,
Cecilia, I'm sorry. One quick thing. And this is kind of I as a risk management professional tend to focus on probably too much on where things are not as good as they need to be. But look, all is not dire. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about this later on, but specific to information about elections, there is an effort by the National Association of Secretaries of State and the National Association of State Election Directors. It's called Trusted Info 2022. That's a hashtag on Twitter or whatever social media platform you're on. But the whole kind of concept of this effort and this information campaign is you can be on whatever social media platform or whatever you're listening to, podcast or on the radio. But if you want to know what's going on with an election, when you're supposed to vote, where you're supposed to vote, when the polls are open, what sort of ID or even just checking, go to either your state election official, so your Secretary of State, state election director, or your county voting official, your county voting registrar or recorder or whatever the model is in your county. That's where you go get information. Don't listen to national figures on this stuff. Listen to the local election official or the state election official. They have the information that you need to make sure that you're an informed voter, at least for the process. Your policy decisions are all up to you, but at least in the process of voting, in the administration of voting, you need to look to your state or local election official.
They know the local laws. Let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing right now in terms of foreign actors taking advantage of this chaos. Where is it coming from and how is it taking shape?
Yeah, I mean, it's sitting where I am on the outside in 22 is a bit different than it was in 2020. Constantly tracking threats. We had a full-blown intelligence dashboard of what was going on. But from what I'm picking up and the reports and alerts that I'm seeing that the U.S. government is issuing, they are not aware of any specific plan or intent to disrupt the 22 election. They have seen some activity. There was a report from a week or two ago about Chinese government actors or Chinese linked cyber actors scanning state party systems and maybe state systems as well. And that is something that we have not really historically seen. We've seen them, look at, voter polling information, register information to do some kind of sentiment analysis. But actually going after kind of the bits and pieces of election infrastructure, I'm not sure we've really seen the Chinese do that at scale. And so where the Russians kind of were doing this and the Chinese were right below them, it's possible the Chinese are trying to pick up a little bit or catch up. And this is consistent, I think, more broadly with Chinese information operations. As a French think tank last year issued a report, and they called it the Russification of Chinese information operations. So they're absolutely learning from some of the things that the Chinese or the Russians rather have done in the past. In terms of the Iranians were active in 2020. I would suspect that some of those actors are still around. They're doing some of the same stuff. They've been sanctioned, and there have been some indictments, but they're still there. So I wouldn't be surprised to see. A lot of this is kind of the things the Iranians did. They ran a couple different information operations. One of them was to pose as the Proud Boys and targeting voters in a couple states, saying we know who you're registered for, and you better change your registration. You better not vote for that guy, or we're going to come after you, which was actually easily debunkable. And that was actually not a campaign that caught on, and it didn't have a whole bunch of engagement and didn't really impact, I think, the broader understanding, because it was a little sloppy, but also, it was the Iranian efforts in 2020, October 2020, were part of, kind of what launched the rumor control program at CISA in late October. And all rumor control was something that we took, frankly, from FEMA, because in the wake of every hurricane, there are fraudsters and other grifters that pop up trying to get a little bit of that sweet FEMA, grant action. And so what FEMA would do would post a bunch of different FAQs and debunkers known as rumor control, and say, hey, if you get a call that you need to give someone this information over the phone to get your personal assistance or your public assistance, then that's not true. You should call this number, FEMA hotline, or whatever it was. And so we use that model. And so if it was, hey, if somebody says that they know who you voted for, they may know who you're registered as, but if they tell you they know who you voted for, well, in 40 plus states in the United States, it's the secret ballot. It's kind of the law of the land, and so they can't know who you voted for. So that's how we kind of styled those rumor control models, and CISA continues to do that in anticipation and expectation that there will be other claims, foreign and domestic. So back to kind of the broader space, China, Iran. I keep an eye on Russia as well. I think they're obviously very busy. They have their hands full getting their butts kicked by Ukraine right now. And that includes their cyber operations. That includes their information operations. But they can probably walk gum and, walk and chew gum at the same time. I apparently can't say that line, but they can do it. They can walk and chew gum. And so my concern here, and I think it's shared by some in the national security community, is that as the prospects of Russia, coming out with anything that resembles success or a victory in Ukraine, as that outlook diminishes, then they're going to get a little bit more erratic, use a little bit more of their unconventional capabilities. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that right now, probably this whole ramping up of a dialogue about, or their rhetoric about using tactical nuclear devices in the battlefield, this false flag operation about a Ukrainian dirty bomb, maybe even, as alleged, the disruption and sabotage of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. All those things kind of set a expectation, or again, we talk about permission structures, but if those things are on the table, then certainly an information operation or a offensive cyber operation against a U.S. system, and it doesn't have to just be elections, right? So yes, they could get into a parish in Louisiana or a township in Pennsylvania, and just do something, right? Knock a registration database offline or election night reporting offline, and what would happen? And again, these are the sorts of things that wouldn't have any impact on someone's ability to cast a vote, the tabulation, or the vote itself. So it probably would not be about actually attacking the voting process.
Security.
It's more about attacking our mindset,
our minds,
and creating fear. And that's in part how Russian information operations work. It's a combination of technical and psychological. So again, I could see some sort of trying to introduce a ripple somewhere in the system that would then, they could amplify, but they probably wouldn't even have to amplify all that much, because there's so much paranoia out there, and there's so many people, because of that, again, that constant pressure to delegitimize the 2020 election, where the pump is primed, where people jump on every little thing. It's happening in, so I live in Virginia, and a contractor or a vendor for the state election board issued some voting instructions to, I believe it was about 60,000 or so, 61,000 maybe voters in Virginia. They just gave them the wrong information on where they need to get to go vote. It was weeks in advance of the election, and yet it was immediately being claimed as like, see, this is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Most secure ever, huh? And meanwhile, the whole point is that error by a vendor was detected, and it's been or being corrected in advance of the opportunity to cast the vote. So it shows that resilience is really the model we're shooting for here. It's not 100% security, and I never said that. No one ever said that. Yeah. It's about the resilience of the process. And to your earlier point about some of the voters, or rather some of the officials that are talking about, hey, when I was growing up, it was that one day in November, and everything was counted that night. That's never been the case. So let's just, roll back the clock 150 years. Mail-in voting was widely used during the US Civil War. So mail-in voting has been happening for a long, long time.
Yeah.
80% or so of voters in Arizona vote by mail. Entire states, Washington, Oregon. That doesn't just happen overnight. That takes years, a decade or more, to establish that process and get everybody on board. So these systems, they work, and they work quite effectively. And there's a great deal of integrity in this process. And the real unfortunate threat and the real kind of lack of integrity is the people that are attacking the process throughout.
Yeah. And that kind of leads naturally to the question of how this disinformation and misinformation spreads, and the role of the platforms. Even 2 years ago in the 2020 election, TikTok wasn't nearly the thing it is today. A lot of the more right-wing sites like Truth Social didn't exist exactly. Yeah. Gab, Rumble, they're very popular now. Telegram and the use of Telegram to spread conspiracy theories. There's a really interesting conspiracy theory I tracked today about how the rest of Connex CEO, this is a voting machine, their CEO.
Voting, Cecilia, sorry to interrupt.
Not voting, counting.
So Connex has a program called Poll Chief that is basically for it's logistics management. So these voting jurisdictions, these election jurisdictions, have a number of election officials, and they have schedules they have to cover. So Poll Chief is a technology, it's a program that helps election officials manage almost schedules and clocks and time. And there's a second piece of this about just asset management. How many devices do we need at what precinct, at what time, who's responsible for picking it up? There's nothing to do at all here with the actual administration and the casting of the election. But in the story goes, on this one story, is that there was some poll worker data, personally identifiable information, held on a server allegedly in China, which is a violation of the contract that, again, allegedly, that Connex signed with the jurisdiction in question here. So, but to your point, it has been both used to justify 2020, and then it's also looking forward for current explanations as well. So sorry to interrupt.
Exactly. This is really good.
It's very, very animated.
It's a very important distinction. Thank you. And my point is that it fueled all these new conspiracy theories, basically new versions of these 2020 themes. But as far as that was spread on Telegram, the stuff that I was seeing talk within QAnon communities, talk about the landscape of channels of disinformation. Are there more? Is it more complicated? Is it harder to squash? Are the platforms, clearly many of the platforms don't have very strong moderation policies. How are you thinking about 22 and the platforms and the challenges there?
It's as a former boss of mine called it, it's a dog's breakfast. It's just everything. And it's so much more complex from a diversity of outlets and sources and mechanisms. And it's not just social media platforms, right?
Yes.
We're seeing these alternative journals or kind of questionable journals. And you're seeing the whole pink slime movement of manufactured and fabricated news outlets. You're seeing foreign actors, the Russians do this quite well, where they will use some of their state-owned media and then a next hop out or two that's related to the state-owned media that may promote 95% of the time legitimate news, and then 5% is something that is in alignment with the strategic objectives and whatever information operation or campaign they're trying to push. So it's which I think goes to your bigger point of information pollution is real. And there's so many different sources of information that is not vetted, that is, ultimately kind of the Ferris Bueller, saw down at 31 flavors type thing of that game of telephone that leads to the spread of these conspiracy theories unchecked. And I have personal concerns about specific platforms. I also do wonder, 2 years from now, 2024, what platforms are even going to be used anymore or are still around, or the business model is going to withstand the next couple of years. I mean, there's a lot of change going on in both the technology platforms, the ownerships, the business models, the users, right? And so I think about, and I think it's probably worth kind of highlighting right now of TikTok specifically. It's not just the platform itself, but it's increasingly the way that a certain demographic, a younger cohort, it's where they get their information, they get their news, which, first off, just like thinking about getting your news from not even a news aggregation site, but a social media platform where you have content creators pushing things alongside established outlets. People should be developing their perspective and their worldviews and their specific opinions on political issues and political candidates from a diversity and variety of outlets, and ideally across multiple different political outlets across the political spectrum, but certainly not from a single outlet of some random person that's telling you their view or what they heard. And I think that's kind of the best defense we have right now is diversity from established, well qualified, well vetted outlets. Again, if you're walking down the street in your town, city, or wherever, and there's just a random crazy person on the side of the street yelling about something, you're not going to believe that and say, now I'm going to go vote for this person because I heard that thing, or this is my entire identity now. And more broadly, and I've talked about this before, but I do wonder, among the many, many other ways that COVID has kind of fundamentally changed society over the last few years, but that kind of withdrawal from community, where we had almost inoculation effects built into community engagement, like, just going down to the ice cream shop or going to a soccer game or whatever, choir or whatever it is you're doing on Sunday or Saturday. And those mechanisms kind of kept you in check, and you had things to bounce ideas off of, or things you were thinking about, or things you had heard, and you could take feedback. But when we pulled back into our homes almost during COVID, and you're resorting instead to echo chambers that exist on these social media platforms, where you're alongside people, and people tend to cultivate followers or relationships online of people that think like them, that talk like them, that believe like them. And if something challenges work, right? We're not online. We're not on the social media platform to do work. We want this to be enjoyable, low friction, and fun. And so you get caught in these echo chambers and trapped. And I think that really kind of allowed for the acceleration of conspiracy theory groups and QAnon specifically. And then once you come out and you go back into the world, I think a lot of people are experiencing a shock, and just a great example that I always talk about is would you go up to one of your kids' soccer games or baseball games or whatever, and you say, hey guys, what are y'all doing this weekend? Well, we're going to do this thing. It's like, well, I'm going to Dallas because JFK Jr. is back and he's having a coming out party and I'm really excited. And it's just like, what? So it just shows you how important community is. And it really is a fundamental element of the human condition and how we all seek that contact and that engagement, that validation, and that social engagement. And there are healthy ways to do it. And there are unhealthy ways to do it that are driven by kind of unseen algorithms and hands that are on their end, driven by a financial model. So we've got to kind of rectify, I think, the way the business model behind platforms. And we took a look at that last year with Aspen Institute and the information, the Commission on Information Disorder.
Did that's with your work at the Aspen Institution and that commission, did the platforms take your recommendations? And this is a question, a sort of a tag on to that question from an audience member. If you were brought in as an advisor, what would you tell companies like Meta or YouTube on how to better prepare their platforms for widespread disinformation surrounding elections?
So I will, let me pull back for a second, because I've talked to these platforms over, individually, almost every one of them, since I've been out of government. And, they've come like, hey, how could we do better? What do you think about this? And ultimately, they can do almost everything, or they could do nothing, and they could do everything in between. But what ultimately has to happen is the government needs to step up. And I'm not talking about moderation. The government should not be in the moderation business whatsoever. What the government can do, though, is require transparency in the platforms and require disclosures. And so what I've likened this to in the past, and whether it holds up or not, I don't know, but it allows me to think about some of the immediate steps we can take with the platforms. So what I've likened it to is I like moments, right? I talk about the Sputnik moment. I kind of feel like we're in a post-Enron moment. Enron failed, or was allowed to fail, because there was a failure of transparency. There was a lack of disclosure, and they were able to continue to cook the books. It was illegal. And I'm not at all suggesting what the platforms are doing right now is illegal, but the lack of disclosures and transparency in how they were managing their books led to their ultimate failure. So what I'm hitting at here is that we need something like a Sarbanes-Oxley and the transparency requirements and the disclosure requirements for platforms. And Nate Persily, who is a professor at Stanford Law, has proposed a piece of legislation, and it's worked its way through at various levels of both chambers of the U.S. Congress. But it's a great first step of, we just have to require the platforms to do certain kind of baseline transparency measures. And we added a bunch of additional ones through the Aspen Institute, but it's the basics of, provide access to a set of researchers so that they can look at data holdings in an anonymized, minimized way. There are others about, content moderation by the platforms. They have to keep some sort of record and make it available to whether it's regulators or others, just to make sure we have a sense of what do they say they're doing or their policies are and how are they moderating against it. Things like scope and scale of the super influencers on the platform. You know, what does engagement at scale look like? Who do they engage? How do you backtrack on some of those issues? And there's a number of these recommendations, but the idea is if we can get platforms, social media platforms, to kind of standardize around a core set of disclosures, then we can start benchmarking. And then that will then inform the general public. And I'm not saying that the general public is going to look at these disclosures and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, based on their content moderation policy, I'm not going to use them anymore. Because we know that that's not how US consumers in particular make decisions on what products they use. It's not always about, the whether it's the most secure or the safest. It sometimes, does it come with a free game or a 6-month subscription to the latest streaming service. But nonetheless, I think it'll inform advertisers. I think it can inform some consumers, and ultimately it should lead to some shifts in business model, in particular how algorithms can be used in a fairly capricious manner.
We should look forward a little bit, because 22 is really a precursor to 24, I imagine, given what you've said about the past couple elections as well. How are you thinking about what happens on November 8th? How November 8th will affect, and the days after and the months after will affect 2024?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think there are a number of candidates that are up for office in the 22 election that if they were to win office and be in place in 24, and they were in a position to certify or administer an election first, because there's a lot they can do there, but then administer the election in 24, I would have some concern that they, I'm talking, Mark Fincham in Arizona, Jim Marchant in Nevada. They've all, even Fincham's even said that if he was in office in 24 and Biden, if he were to run again and he were to win, that he wouldn't even entertain the question of whether he would certify. He just said that's fantasy land, which I don't know if that's kind of the new response to the question now that no one seems to be able to answer of are you going to accept the outcome of the election if you lose it? But again, it's like not really getting a good vibe off this one right now. So yeah, I've got concerns in Arizona and even in Pennsylvania, because if Doug Mastriano, and I'm not in the the Larry Sabato crystal ball here of who's going to win these elections, but if he were to win in 22 and be in the position or be in the governorship in 24, that the governor selects the Secretary of State. Mastriano has already said that he is one of those that would try to decertify 2020. He's also said that he would, conduct a fairly significant and thorough purge of the voter rolls in Pennsylvania, and that I think would, have a pretty good chance of leaving a number of voters behind. But then it actually puts them in a position of, actually being able to certify that election. And that's again, I'm trying to bring in where I can some of the controls or the defensive measures, and that's why I think the Liz Cheney and Zoe Lofgren, the congresswomen that put forward the Presidential Electoral Reform Act. I think that clarifies the certification process, who's responsible for certifying, and if they do in fact refuse to certify, what those litigation opportunities are, and then the role, of course, of the state Supreme Courts. And then again, it gives you that escalation path on the will of the people and ensuring that a vote. That the will of the voters is reflected in the state electoral college count.
Chris, this is some pretty revealing and grim stuff that we talked about today. But you did talk about a few things that I think folks should look at, which is Trusted Info 2022 for the best information out there. You talked also about how the process itself is secure. You said it in 2020 that it was the most secure election in history. It sounds like you feel that way again.
Well,
as far as the system,
I try to, don't listen to me. I'm not in office anymore. I had my moment. To the greatest extent possible, I try to point people to credible, trustworthy voices and figures here. And the FBI and CISA a couple weeks ago released an alert that actually was much stronger than anything I ever said, but it said that we've never seen an adversary in a foreign adversary in a position to change a vote, prevent the vote, or change the ultimate tabulation of the voting, and that it's actually unlikely that a voter that they would be able to do so in a manner undetected at scale. And I believe that. I've always believed that. And it's in part because it's really hard. Despite what everybody says, are there vulnerabilities in systems? Yes, there are. There are controls. There are layered defenses. There are vulnerabilities that can be patched. There are parallel testing. There's logic and accuracy. There are audits. One thing that I've been a staunch advocate for years and years is we need as much paper in the system as possible. I've done a lot of media, and not just here but in foreign countries as well. And I constantly get that question of like, hey, we're thinking about going to online voting, and I've had so many near heart attacks in the last couple of weeks. But no, like what we need is evidence-based elections that we can establish over and over and over again the outcome of the election. That's why, from 2016, we had just below 80% of the vote cast had a paper ballot with it. Up through 2020 is about 95%. Now, I don't think we'll ever get to 100% because there's some voters that need accommodations for accessibility purposes at the voting booth, where they will touch the screen and it'll be recorded on media, but as much paper as possible so you can go up and count and recount and then count again if you want, or another time. And that's what happened in Georgia and Pennsylvania. And that's what gave us as much confidence as we had, was because we knew that there was paper there.
Back it up. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. And Chris, thank you so much for being here tonight for what is a critical time to be exchanging such important information and ideas. Thank you to our online audience. If you enjoyed this program, please remember to fill out a quick 2-minute survey using the QR code on the screen so we can continue bringing relevant and inspiring content to 92Y. Finally, as mentioned earlier, tonight's event was a prelude to the upcoming Aspen Cyber Summit on November 16th, 2022. Also hosted in person at the 92nd Street Y, New York, and available online to live stream. We'll put up on the screen a link to register and a special promo code. It was an honor to be part of the program with the 92nd Street Y and Aspen Digital. Thank you so much, Chris. It's great to talk to you always, and especially on this topic. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.